Thank you very much, everybody, for joining this event. Good afternoon and welcome to the Business Declares event, which is entitled The Role of Activism in Business. So I'm Ben Tolhurst, I'm from Business Declares, and working with me today is also Lucy Hawthorne, who's also from Business Declares, and Sam Baker, who I think, Sam, you're the brains behind Walk to COP27. And at which point, Sam, do you want to come in here briefly and do any quick plugs or background that you need to before we move on?
Sure, just very briefly then. So first of all, it is on replay, by the way, everybody. We expect people to sort of dip in and dip out, but this is all on replay, and then people can market that as an audio, or they can market it as part of Clubhouse as a replay. So yes, Walk to COP27 is all about mass participation in the run-up to COP27. So effectively, our job is almost done. It had a number of different parts. One was walking with us on an app. So we've got about 1,600 people who'll be walking until the 18th of this month, raising each kilometre translating into one tree planted in Burundi with the Jane Goodall Institute. That's one bit. The second bit is a series of town hall meetings. So we had our last one in Jordan on Monday. And those have been, the idea of those are expositions of local climate challenges and their responses. And we all dial in and we learn something about it. And then the third bit is a series of Clubhouse sessions like this. And so we've tried to sort of bring those together and each time to talk about COP or allow at least some sort of reference to COP and try and create some sort of collective appetite and information sharing, connections, learning in the run up. So that's what it is. There's two things left, which I'd just like to draw your attention to. So one is if you go onto the website, www.walk2cop27.com, there is one of the tabs allows you to click on, so to participate, and then you can click on register here. You can get on the app. And so for the last 17 days, you can, whatever you do, walk, run, cycle, or wheelchair, you can clock your kilometers, and those will be translated into those trees that we talked about. We want to get to 100,000 trees if we can, so please do that. The second thing to look out for is that we are planning a session to talk about our findings of all these different town halls, of the different clubhouses we've had, and also of all the conversation that we've had over social media. So we want to bring that together and put that into COP, and that'll probably be during the second week of the virtual session. So please look out for those two things. But Ben, back to you. I think this topic is absolutely at the center of moving business in the right direction. I think it's so needed. I saw your interview, by the way, on LinkedIn yesterday, I think it was. So good for you. Really looking forward to the session and looking forward to hearing from all the panelists that you brought together.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sam. And thanks for highlighting those two areas for participants to have a look at. So welcome, everybody. Business Declares, I just want to say a couple of things about Business Declares first. We are a business network organisation and we support businesses to help them accelerate their plans in tackling the climate, ecological and social emergency. But one of the other things we do is convene discussions on perhaps some of the more awkward and challenging topics which face business. For example, offsetting greenwashing, degrowth, and of course, today's topic, which is about the role that businesses could or should play in relation to climate activism. So we're going to be here for an hour. The format should be really informal and discussion based. I'll remind everybody the event's being recorded and will be made available afterwards. Can I also remind everybody, if you want to put your questions in the chat by swiping right, or you can raise your virtual hand to ask a question. We'll keep an eye on that and we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. Just before I introduce our fantastic panelists, I just want to give a little bit of context to this, just to set the scene. So what I'd like to say is the voices of Greta Thunberg Rebellion, I mean, they've really pushed the issue of the climate emergency right up on everybody's agenda. And that was from, I suppose, about 2019 onwards. And since then, there has been a significant number of climate related protests. So as well as Extinction Rebellion, we've had groups like Insulate Britain, we've had Just Stop Oil, and they've been undertaking more and more different actions, from basic marches right through to road blocking, throwing super artwork and scaling bridges. Now, some of these actions have been vilified by certain members of the press and individuals as being disruptive to the everyday, but other full support of these actions, highlighting the desperate need really to wake up and see the climate and ecological unfolding in front of our eyes. Now, businesses tend to have a tendency, I guess, to want to stay out of this discussion. It's a little bit awkward. It's not really in the scope of business, and no doubt there's a bit of a perception that it's political and it risks turning off customers or maybe upsetting shareholders. But I am proposing that businesses cannot avoid this, proposing that businesses need to be expressing a viewpoint on climate activism and consider what sorts of policies and actions they might want to have in relation to this. Now, for one thing, research is showing us that people are increasingly pressing their employers for their stance on the climate emergency. But let's also not forget that climate protesters are actually people. Many are employees as well, and they will have questions and no doubt concerns about what their employers think about their individual involvement in climate protests. Now, you may have seen, interestingly, just a few weeks ago in October, there was a poll carried out by Omnisis, which is a registered member of the British Polling Council. And that poll reported that the majority of UK people, 66% in fact, actually support non-violent direct action. So for these reasons alone, and I'm sure many more besides, businesses really do need to formulate their viewpoint on the topic of climate activism. But what should it be? So here with us to debate this topic are representatives from the business and the activism community. We've got Tom Greenwood, the CEO of Whole Grain Digital. We've got Charmian Love, Head of Advocacy at Natura & Co. and previously activist in residence at B-Lab. And we've got Craig Scudder, who is a business owner, but he's also a very active member of Just Stop Oil. What I'd like to do now is just ask our panelists in turn to give a brief on themselves. And if you could come off mute. Cool.
Yes, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hear you fine.
Great. Yes, so as you mentioned, I run a company called Whole Grain Digital, which is a digital agency based in London that has a big focus on sustainability, both in terms of the way we run the company in our operations, the type of projects that we work on, but also exploring the issue of the environmental impact of digital technology and how we can ensure that digital technology is helping actually solve problems rather than creating new environmental problems. And one of the things that we've been exploring recently, and I've spoken to you about it, Ben, over email, is how can we support our employees in activism? So something we can talk about, but also just generally, what does it mean for us to support climate change in a way that seems appropriate from a business perspective?
Great, thank you, Tom. That was really interesting, and I think we'll come back to the point that you just made about how you're thinking that your business can maybe support activism. Shah, over to you. Let's get a little bit of background and intro from you, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you so much, Ben, for the invitation to be on this call. And it's great to be on this call with some friends and fellow travelers from over the years. And Tom, great to see your face on the screen and to hear your voice. I think it was last at a B-Lab retreat where we connected. But yeah, just very briefly. So again, I'm Charmian Love, and I've been engaged in the climate space in different shapes and forms for many years. When I came to the UK from Canada, I co-founded a little think tank consultancy called Volans with a pretty well-known thought leader in this space, John Elkington, as well as the late, great Pamela Hartigan. And that was really an important part of the journey because it was John's goal and sort of spirit is really around looking at ways for us to think about systems change and looking at ways to be in conversation with unusual and unreasonable thinkers and doers, from entrepreneurs to activists. But one of the steps in my journey from Volans was we certified as a B Corp very early on, and I fell so deeply in love with what it meant to be a B Corp that I ended up seconding myself out of my CEO role at Volans and working alongside a group of other entrepreneurs to start the B Corp movement here in the UK. So I was the chair of B-Lab UK until just a couple of years ago, where I transitioned into the role, as you mentioned, Ben, as of activist in residence. And I'll be happy to share a little bit more about what some of the findings and learnings and insights we collected from that time of really talking to a lot of business leaders and activists about what this really tricky intersectional space between business and movements and activism looks like and feels like, and where and how businesses can explore this as a really important area for leadership. We also, Ben, met, I think, in that phase where I was in that role at B-Lab UK, because we sort of came together with Business Declares in the very early days. And one of the pieces that I'm really quite proud of that we developed at B-Lab UK quite quickly around the time of the April Rebellion was the playbook for business on how to take action and declare a climate emergency. And that's still available for download for anyone who's interested. But that was a way that we brought together a range of businesses, as well as some insight on what businesses could meaningfully do to take action. And I think that was around the same time that Business Declares was getting up and running. So it was an important sort of set of links that I think were built to really encourage and support businesses to move into these spaces. Fast forward to today, and 6 months ago, I stepped away from my role at B-Lab UK as activist in residence and joined the world's largest B Corp, which is Natura & Co., as you said, as the global director of advocacy. Now, some of you may not be as familiar with Natura & Co. as a company. Some of you may be. But Natura & Co., just to be clear, is the holding company, which has within it a series of brands that you might know of. So Natura is the Brazilian beauty business. We also in our family have Avon, Aesop, and The Body Shop. And I just wanted to sort of signal that because I think it's really interesting where and how different businesses are thinking about engaging in this space. Obviously, a company like The Body Shop, with its roots with an incredible incredible founder in Dame Anita Roddick, activism is very alive in that business, and so it's a place where it's really interesting to understand again where that intersection between business and activism sits. I'm also happy, maybe as we go into the questions, to talk a little bit more about advocacy and activism. Those are two words that both start with A, and I think I'm interested in further conversations about where and how those two concepts, come together and where they're different, but it's certainly part of the journey I'm on right now. So that's probably enough. And thank you, Ben, for the invitation to be on the call. And I'm really excited to hear more about what the others have to say on this topic, as well as some of the questions that I hope will come up too. Thank you.
We'll definitely be talking about insights to activism and business, and we'll also be talking about definitions in a second about what is activism, non-violent direct action, etc. What terms should we be using and where does advocacy come into that? So we'll be coming back to those. Craig, could I pass over to you now, please?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So I guess I've got a foot in both camps here. I'm a fairly active member of Just Stop Oil, and before that Insulate Britain, where I was one of the spokespeople, and indeed Extinction Rebellion. I've got a bit of a rap sheet going on for arrests and convictions for basically direct action with regard to climate change. And my business is a house building company, and we build houses that are kind of a passive house plus standard house, but we use materials that sequester away carbon. So we're quite unique, really, because I don't know of any other, and I'm only a small developer, but I don't know of any other developers that build houses of this type, apart from individual appointments. So I'm just starting a 6-house build in Watford, and it's quite interesting to find that there aren't really any incentives for house builders like me to build really high quality houses that are the answer to, I think it's 14% of our emissions come from our housing. So, discussions I've had with councils about that, but that's a whole other topic, I guess. So I've got a bit of a experience with how being an activist can be difficult as just somebody who works in business, let alone then having a small business. I'm just in the process of getting a couple of million quid's worth of funding for my next project, and my record as an activist has made that way more complicated than it would have been had I not have had this record. So that's a big part of, I think, the discussion hopefully we're going to have today about how we mainstream the idea of people being involved in activism before it's too late, to enable people to step up and take part. Because as I'm sure most of you will be familiar with from people that they know, or any activism that they've taken part in, probably the biggest concern when you're trying to recruit people for any of these activist actions is what effect it will have on their employment if they get arrested. And that's kind of, to a large extent, down to us, right? Anyway, that's me. I'll pass back to you now, Ben.
Thank you very much, Craig. Yeah, really interesting point that you make about having a record of arrests or convictions, and what that does to your role, and what a prospective employer should or shouldn't do, or could do. And I know Tom will definitely have something to say about that a bit later on. So thank you all for your intros. I just wanted to start with a really brief contextual question, and I just wanted to hear from each of you about what do you see as the implications for business of the current climate crisis? How is this crisis affecting and likely to affect business, just as a contextual setting? Again, just a minute or two from each of you, just to get your views on this. We'll mix up the order a bit, and maybe Shah, we'll come to you first.
Sure. Well, that's a question that you could, speak to forever, actually. So I will try and be brief. And at the risk of sort of just a simple soundbite, I mean, there is no business on a burning planet, so it's everything. And to go more specific, I do think it's important to, recognize all the different touch points. I mean, climate is, is a reflection of who we like, how we have to engage in this as humans. And so I'm could talk about supply chains and risks and the sorts of things that we're seeing and feeling immediately. But I actually am inclined to take a very sort of more human-centric approach to this and say it affects us all as people. And I think what we'll see and continue to see growing is people sort of waking up and wanting to make sure that they are finding ways to be on the right side of history. And let's be clear, that history is being made with every decision that is being made right now, whether it's in business or in our lives, our daily lives. So I think, I'd say at a big level, everything. And to sort of put something I'd love to discuss more deeply, it's important to, I think, anchor this in the human experience and the human lens. And obviously the people who work in businesses both have the opportunity to take decisions, but also will be deeply impacted by and continue to be impacted by what's happening around us right now. So hopefully that's a helpful immediate reaction. And I'd love to hear what the other panelists have to say, as well as some of the people who are on the line. So maybe that's a great question to also throw out to the chat.
Cool. Thank you very much. And yes, just on that, anybody, just a reminder again, if you want to raise a question, stick it in the chat or do a virtual hand raise, and we will keep an eye on who's got their hands up. So thank you for that. I won't comment on that directly. I'll let the other two panelists give their view first, and then maybe we can have a quick summation before we move on. Tom, your take on the implications of this and/or reaction to anything that Shah just said.
Yeah, well, I think everything that Charles said is spot on, and you could talk about this forever because it's sort of an infinitely complex topic because it affects everything. But I think the key point is that the world is changing, and it's going to continue changing, and so businesses really at this point face a choice of, do you kind of want to get on board with trying to make the change as positive as it can be and actually be part of that process, or do you want to fight against it and struggle resisting it? Because it's going to change. Businesses that resist it are going to get left behind in the long run, even if they get some advantages in the short run. So, I think that's probably the key point from my perspective, is that actually, like, we've got to make a choice of, do you want to, like, help reinvent a positive future, or are you going to kind of stick your dig your heels in and try and stay still and get left behind?
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Tom. Your line was a little bit shaky, but I think everybody got the gist of what you said, and I will do a summary of that in a second. Craig, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? And I don't want to bang on with kind of quotes from people that you're very well aware of, but if we take Sir David King, who said, 18 months ago we have 3 or 4 years to determine the future of humanity. We're talking about that possibly in the next 2-3 years, the first domino could fall, right? And if the first domino falls, then we're at a point where we're playing catch up, and it may not be possible to stop more tipping points coming into play. So, in my experiences as a house builder, there are multiple decisions I have to make during the course of a project about materials I use predominantly, rather than anything else. And to build a house that is as eco-friendly as possible, it will cost me more than just building a house would. And I'm able to make the decision to build the most environmentally friendly house possible, because I know with a big ticket item like that, I can charge a premium for building a house that is actually made of low carbon materials. That decision is much harder to make on low value products, I would imagine, where you're in a competitive marketplace and you're not able to charge 15% more. So I would suggest that the biggest role that business has to play over the next few years is to really funnel employees through to activism. Because there are only 2 ways that we solve this crisis. And those 2 ways are, we either solve it in time or we don't. And for us to solve this in time and make any meaningful change in the time we have available, right, which I've said maybe as low as 2 or 3 years, we can only do that from the ground up, from the bottom up. Okay? We know if a domino falls, that will put enough pressure on the government to change policy. But if we want to stop this in its tracks before a domino falls, then we don't just need 200 people sitting on roads during the course of October for Just Stop Oil. We need thousands of people. And the easiest way we can make that happen is to pathway people that work in our businesses towards activism by making it easier for them, by giving them guarantees of job security, by giving them days off for activism, right? The big companies give you days off to go tree planting. You should get a day off to get involved in activism. So things like that, I think, are the main role of business in helping this fight.
Cool, thank you. And I do want to come back to some of those points in a second, because you've started to answer a question that's coming later, but captured your point to them. So from this contextual conversation, there's a sort of very strong feeling that, no business on a dead planet, to use Shah's quote. The world is changing. Do you want to get on board, or do you want to dig your heels in and resist, to use Tom's quote? And Craig, solve it in time or you don't. And one of the ways of doing that is to funnel employees into activism. If we're bought in contextually that is the situation, we hear the definition of activism, we hear non-violent direct action, we hear protest, we hear civil resistance, and I'm suspecting that all of these words have different sorts of baggages and reactions from different people, and it may well be that certain words turn people off and certain words turn people on, and it may even be this movement some words and phrases over others. Could we just try and just explore quickly this whole concept of definition? So I mean, Craig, if you could come in now, help me out. What's the kind of preferred term from your perspective as an activist, and what does it mean? And maybe importantly, what doesn't it mean?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Well, it's funny because we spend a lot of time talking about this, and we're not activists per se. You know, we are just ordinary people. You know, I spent 20 years working in the city. I watched a film in 2015 that kind of woke me up and made me get involved in this. But the people that I'm, you know, whether it's sitting on top of an oil tanker with or what have you, they don't describe themselves as activists. You know, it's a label that we've been given, isn't it? But it's just ordinary people feeling desperate and helpless. So I think an activist is someone who spends their time advocating for change. I don't think you can, you know, I wouldn't be your idea of an activist, right? I go to the rugby club on Saturdays, I go and watch QPR play, I play golf, you know, I just care about the climate, you know, and there are other people. We're not all of a similar ilk, I don't think. So I think it's just anyone that's willing to spend some of their time forcing through change.
Great, thank you for that. That's really clear and a really heartfelt viewpoint and definition. And Shah, if I can come to you now, any reaction to what Craig has said, and in particular from your previous roles as activist in residence and indeed your advocacy role now, what do you think to what Craig just said, and is there anything you want to build on?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, Sam, with what you've put in the chat. It's a great definition. And I actually was really interested as you were speaking, Craig, that you brought advocacy into the definition of activist. So that's really, and again, this is part of the journey I'm on a little bit to understand how these different concepts, not just how are they defined, but also how do they fit together. But this was a question. This was, you know, in the 1-year project we did for this activist business project, that was the first question we went out to try and understand is what do we mean by activist and activism? And, you know, there's tons and tons of definitions in academic discourse and dictionaries. And, but in talking to some activists, actually one in particular, I think the definition that really resonated with me was this idea that what activism is really about is being able to see your edge, seeing it, witnessing it, and like walking up to it, and then being able to step beyond it. And that the reason why I like that definition is that it means it's a relative concept, right? Everyone's edge is going to be a little bit different, but the important part is you stretch yourself to go beyond maybe necessarily what you're comfortable with, because let's be honest, these are not comfortable times, and these are, you know, it's not comfortable what's happening and what we're going to need to do to fix it. So I think I like that, because for some people, being an activist will be stretching themselves to go on the front lines of a major protest. But for others, being an activist might be putting their hand up in a meeting and speaking up about climate in a context where they might not have otherwise, or making an appointment with their MP and speaking up to their representative of government to say how important it is to take action. So again, that's the definition that I really like and I kind of hold on to. You know, and the second part actually that I would love just to bring into this discussion as well is recognizing that there's many different ways, as I've just said, the different tactics of being an activist, but also, you know, the different ways you can sort of identify as one and maybe not even call yourself an activist, to the point that was made earlier around some of the charge that's in that word in itself. There's two quizzes I like, which are out there. One of them is actually put together by the Body Shop, and they have a series of questions you can go through, which is essentially designed to help you understand what kind of change maker are you. You know, so you answer 5 questions, and what it will come out with is sort of a reflection based on your answer to those questions. You know, are you more of a quiet practitioner? Are you more of a frontline leader? Are you more of an organizer? So I find that's a helpful tool just to sort of calibrate, you know, both what best suits who you are and what you're able to do and what kind of stretch you're able to bring, but also then to also see what are the other kinds of activists or change makers that are out there. So that's one quiz that's out there. The other one I also really like is from Clover Hogan at Force of Nature. So she has similarly a digital online quiz where, again, you go through these questions and it sort of comes out with the kind of activist you are. What she does also that I think is great is she outlines what your strengths are in that particular identity of change maker, but also what, you know, the challenges are that you might face. I think that's a really helpful reflection. And she also sort of highlights some of the activists that are out there that follow that particular change-making strategy so that you can follow them and sort of build a sense of community. So those are, I guess, my responses, to agree with Craig and be interested in this advocacy and activist intersection. To recognize this has got to be about going to seeing an edge and then going over it, and recognizing that there are tools out there that help people to really understand the real plethora of different ways in which people can be change makers, whether they call themselves an activist or not.
Thanks for that, Shah. We've had some great comments in the chat, which I'm going to come back to once we've heard from Tom. And Tom, any reactions to what you've heard there? Anything to build?
Yeah, well, I think everything that I heard from Craig and Shah there was absolutely amazing. The only thing I sort of really wanted to add was just sort of, for me, the essence is in the word activism. It's active, and I think it's about being active in trying to create the type of world that you want to live in, rather than being passive. And I think anybody who is taking action and being active in a way that's meaningful to them, effectively is an activist, even if they don't look at it that way, even if they don't want to be framed that way. Like, I think, it doesn't have to be about necessarily like going on a march or doing something that would be traditionally termed activism. I think there's lots of people contribute in lots of different ways, and we all need to be basically, trying to create progress from whatever direction we feel we can contribute.
Great, thank you, Tom. Just picking up on what we said there, I love the idea of this willing to spend time to force through change, which is what Craig said. But also, let's remember, as he said, these are ordinary people, and it's quite often, dare I say, the press who give a particular view or image of a, inverted commas, activist as being something or other, and actually at root that isn't the case. These are ordinary people, as Craig has pointed out, who are willing to spend their time forcing through change. I love the idea of this getting beyond the edge, forcing yourself out the comfort zone. We've had a number of people in the chat who really like this idea of change in eds. Samantha Cooper, Donna, Louise, Lucy, this idea of pushing yourself into something beyond what you're necessarily comfortable with. And I like Tom's juxtaposition of active versus passive. The whole point of being activism of being an activist is that you're doing something, as opposed to somebody that kind of sits by and watches, and I think that's a really important way of looking at this as well. I'm going to just move on now to bringing this into the business context. So we've heard about the background, as in the climate and the environment that businesses are in, and what that means for them. We've heard about what an activist is or isn't, and does or doesn't. What I'd like to do now is understand, what do you think businesses' response should be to the whole activism agenda? And I will come to you first, Craig, because you started to answer this question already. You talked about businesses doing some things like giving days off. You talked about businesses, your words, funneling employees into activism. Could you say a few more things from your activist perspective? What would you like to see businesses doing?
Yes, thanks, Ben. Well, I really do think the key to this is that we need to grow, whether it's the number of people that are willing to take part in actions for Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion or Greenpeace. We need to grow that exponentially in the next couple of years. And from being in meetings, back as far back as 2019, when Extinction Rebellion was fairly new, the main concern that people have is whether getting involved will mean they lose their jobs. I think that using better business practices, materials, etc., are all very important parts of trying to solve the massive issues we face. But I don't think on their own they're going to have enough impact in time. So I think that the key here is making people feel that they can take part in activism whilst they're working for your company, which, as I say, can be done. I mean, the statements. I mean, my firm is such a small firm that we don't have a strategy on social responsibility or an environmental strategy. But I know that a lot of businesses will have these. And for me, it's quite key that it spells out that getting involved in activism for environmental issues is going to be looked kindly upon. Not even just, we'll allow it, but we'll encourage it. In the same way that I've spent a day tree planting with 50 people from Tesco's, wouldn't it be great to get involved in an action with 20 people from a company who were able to take a paid day off to be doing it?
Thanks, Craig. So very clear message from you to businesses with regard to what you would like to see, which is a acceptance and encouragement that people can take part in activism without fear of losing their job, and also being given the sufficient time in which to do it. That's kind of a nice segue, Tom, into something that you're considering and working on. Do you want to come in here and reflect on anything Craig said and again add to that?
Yeah, well, I think it was really interesting, Craig, to hear that sort of that main concern is, how taking part in something would affect employment. And the thing that I've been talking to Ben about over email over the last couple of weeks has been us introducing I don't know what we're going to call it, to be honest, but some sort of like activism policy for our staff, which basically lays all this stuff out that says that we want to encourage you to take part in the things that are meaningful to you in terms of activism, and we don't want you to feel that it's going to affect your employment. So explaining that there are some boundaries around that in terms of non-violence, for example, but you're not going to lose your job. We will give you some time off, and we're going through a sort of review process at the moment where all of our team have got access to a draft that we've been iterating, and they're giving their feedback on it. And Ben also kindly has been offering his feedback too. So we're trying to see like how we can just make it crystal clear for people that, like, look, if you want to do something, this is how we can support you, and you don't need to worry about losing your job, because we're actually grateful to you that you've got the guts to go out and stand up for something when not all of us do. Yeah.
Cool, brilliant. Thank you for that. And Lucy, your question about the size of the business and its impact on this, I want to bring you in a second once we've heard from Shah, because I think it's very pertinent at this point. But Shah, we've heard from Craig, we've heard from Tom talking about his activism policy. What's your take on this? How were things being thought of where you work currently, and what views do you have?
Yeah, great. And I would just sort of totally support everything that's been said. And actually, I think there's also a real opportunity for sharing these sorts of documents or these sorts of policies across businesses. And I think the B Corp movement might be one platform to do that. Tom, you may know, Koja is a really interesting example where what they did is they pay the legal fees for their employees that are arrested due to nonviolent civil disobedience, and if you are in jail, they continue to pay you. So I mean, like, there's so many interesting ways to approach this, and I think there's some really great examples of within the B Corp community that have leaned into this and are trying to understand those policies. So I would just say maybe there's some sharing, and with Business Declares. So yeah, I almost don't want to revisit anything that's already been said, but I would say this was another output of the Activist Business Project, where we just tried to be really specific of what does it mean to be an activist business? Like, what does this actually look like in practice? So I might reflect a little bit more on that rather than necessarily everything that's going on at Natura and Co and our brands, but as a very basic framework, the 5 things that we sort of came up with in our review, having talked to various businesses that were in this space was number one, exactly where we've started, which is this is about people and supporting, enabling your people to be activists. That actually is one of the key ways a business can be an activist business. But there's other things they can do as well. Taking a stand when there are things that are happening that require us to take a stand publicly is important. And I think of my friends at the Body Shop who came out very publicly in opposition of the police and crime bill. That was an example of a very clear taking a stand on something that they felt very, very strongly about. And I think there are many opportunities to do that, increasingly, unfortunately, opportunities to be out there and taking a stand. So that's the second thing. The third is to walk the talk. And I think this really is important when we think about business models and what businesses have the potential to do when it comes to talking to people, sharing and encouraging conversations about the interconnected emergencies we're facing. And I know we are focusing on climate on this conversation as it's part of the walk to COP27, but we know from COP27 that this is the climate emergency is an emergency that intersects with the emergency of people and what people are experiencing, feeling. So I would just say this business model piece and walking the talk, I think is about absolutely climate. It's also about ways in which we consider all the different elements of the impacts our businesses have and ways in which we can have our businesses create positive externalities through business models. The fourth thing is really, I think it's already been also touched on, is joining forces with others. One business in itself can be an activist business, but where power, I think, really comes from is through collective action and working, whether it's sectorally, regionally, geographically, but joining forces. And I think Toast Ale is a great example where they came together actually with some of their competitors to run their project Brew for Change. And it was designed to show, like, we as an industry, a beer industry, believe this is a crisis and we are coming together to draw attention to it. And if we can do that as competitors, like, come on, governments, you got to do it too. So I think that's a really important way to think about the power that businesses can have and how they can be activist. And then the last one is about systems change. And I think, from B-Lab UK's perspective, Chris Turner, who's the executive director, really wisely took some time to really understand and unpack what we mean by systems change. And because that's a term that's getting thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean? And I really love how Chris approached it, because I think the essence of what we mean by systems change is recognizing the importance of both regulatory change and culture change. Like, we need both of those elements if we are going to change a system. In other words, you can change the rules of the game, but you got to make sure people are there and following the rules. Or, culture will eat strategy for breakfast, and culture is what people do when nobody's looking. So it's almost, we need both the rules of the game changed as well as it to be a cultural phenomenon. And I think businesses, again, have a really important role in both of those components of systems change. And maybe that's where I would link back to the concept of advocacy, because I think the definition, I'm going to be hesitant as I say this because I am still trying to figure this out, but my sense is the essence of what advocacy is about. Advocacy is about systems change. It's about recognizing that, yes, your business can do a whole lot of things on sustainability internally, and those are very important things that need to get done. And we need to be engaging in these systems change. And so for me, advocacy intersects with activism because it is about engaging and pushing for regulatory change as well as cultural change. So Ben, sorry, that was a bit of a longer answer, but just to summarize, those 5 things are: engage your people, take a stand, walk the talk with your business model, join forces with others, and like go to the edge and beyond when it comes to systems change.
Cool. Thank you for that. Really, really great feedback on all of those things. I think we're in danger of having some kind of business charter for activism with the stuff that Craig and Tom talked about earlier folded into some of these 5-point plans. And on the walk to talk, I think greening your business, Craig, as you've pointed out, would probably be part and parcel of that. Lucy, I do want to bring you in here because you raised a question very early on in this, and it strikes a chord with me. It's like, this is easier to do in some businesses than others. But Lucy, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Ben. I guess when I was asking the question about does it make a difference, the size or type of business, the main thing I was thinking about really is, I suppose, businesses' perceptions of themselves, of what is or isn't possible. And perhaps I'm making an assumption here, but smaller businesses, for example, might perceive that if, taking a more activist stance might be a risk to their, their business essentially. So that's kind of where my mind went to it, because we often think about activist businesses being some of the big names, particularly those that Shah's mentioned. And so I guess I'm just interested in what the panelists would say if they've noticed a difference in how different sizes of businesses particularly have interpreted their activist potential. And that might be related to the way that consumers and citizens perceive different kinds of businesses, like the idea that if you're a really big business, then actually you can do those things, but maybe it's not your place if you're, regular smaller business on the street. So I don't have a conclusion, but I'm curious into businesses' notion of what's possible.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Craig, I want to come to you first. You've been in big business in a city, and you've also been in smaller business in terms of employees with the company that you run. Which is easier, big or small, and why?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I'm going to kind of straddle the fence on this. It's obviously way easier to force through change in a smaller business, but there are different risks, aren't there? And just to talk about business, assuming that all kind of businesses are similar. If you're a business that trades on its reputation, then damaging that reputation by being involved in activism that the Daily Mail goes after, let's say, right, could put you in a perilous position. And it wouldn't take much for a small business to find itself in that kind of situation. So I would say that with a small business, it is easier to get change. But yeah, is it a riskier thing to undertake? It depends really, I guess, on the type of business. For me, the only risk I have is getting credit, right? Some finance companies and banks would be put off by activism, and some wouldn't. When it comes to the product I actually produce, my activism is probably a plus there. But yeah, going the other way, looking at bigger firms. Obviously, I mean, I some of the firms I worked in the city were thousands of employees just in London, and trying to get change there. I had policy ideas probably 20 years ago now for tree planting at one of the city businesses I worked on. And we didn't get, I didn't manage to get anything done because I was so far away from being the person that had to sign off on that, that it was very difficult. But equally, I think, the big risks are reputational damage, aren't they? And we've got to try and mainstream it to get past that. But it's tricky.
Cool, thank you. And I'll probably go to Tom now. Tom, you're a smallish business. You're, from what you said, looking at getting behind the activism. How are you dealing with the risk of reputational damage from your perspective by speaking out and doing what you're planning to do?
Yeah, well, I think there's reputational risk and there's financial risk, which obviously feed into each other in some way. But I think from a reputational risk point of view, it's not so much our size as it is like the type of business we run and the type of clients we have. And I think just the nature of who we are and who we work for, as long as, I think the risks are probably relatively small for us reputationally, so long as people are being, non-violent. Whereas I think for some other companies, perhaps like more consumer-focused brands, we're a digital agency, so we're like B2B, and we work with purpose-led organizations who care about the sorts of things we'd be campaigning for. So actually, reputationally, it would generally be positive for us if our employees were out campaigning for things, as long as it was non-violent. But for other companies, that might not be the case. their target customers might be the sort of people who actually don't appreciate various types of activism. And they might be more consumer facing, which makes it easier for the media to really give them a hard time. You know, if the Daily Mail wrote an article about whole grain digital employees blocking a road in central London, to be quite honest, I'm not convinced it would affect our business that much, because people who read it would probably never have heard of whole grain digital anyway, and then not our target customers. So I think it's more about who you are than how big you are in that sense. But on the financial side, I think the size makes a difference, because Char mentioned about, like, for example, like Ecosia, and how, you know, part of their policy is they'll cover legal fees for their employees if they get arrested and charged with something during a protest. And in developing this sort of activism support policy that we're working on at the moment, the key question for us is, like, how much support can we give in terms of, like, time off and things like, you know, can we afford to cover legal fees? Because as a small business, we don't want to make promises to our employees that we can't follow through on. So I think every business is going to need to be realistic about its own level of resources and offer the support that it can genuinely provide. And bigger businesses will be able to provide more support in some areas, and then, as Greg said, smaller businesses might not be able to provide necessarily as much resources, but they might be able to be more agile in actually just being supportive and actually just getting stuff done.
Cool. I love your distinction about reputation is probably more linked that you work for rather than anything else, and you articulated that really eloquently, Tom, and so thank you for that. Shah, you work in a huge organisation where no doubt working for a whole load of having a whole load of supply chain, as well as working for a whole load of B2B and B2C customers. So it must be perhaps a tricky one for you. But are you able to respond to anything from the last speakers and build on that at all?
Yeah, I'd love to respond. And I'll also respond with sort of a level of I'm on a learning journey. So I have spent most of my career working with small businesses and with B-Lab UK, which is obviously in service to businesses of all shapes and sizes. And now I am in a big company. So I sort of am trying to make sense of the different altitudes. And I think the thing that I would most want to pick up and agree with that's been said is there's different ways small businesses and big businesses can engage, and there's sort of different challenges and different opportunities. And I use that word opportunity somewhat awkwardly in my mouth, because again, I don't think of any of this necessarily as being opportune because it is a crisis and an emergency. But I think there's small companies that have advantages that will allow them to do things in certain ways. And then there are other things that big companies can do. So I hope that's not too vague a response, but it is just to acknowledge that there's things that each can do that I think are important and relevant here. And many of the specifics have already been brought up in terms of, speed, resources, and scale. I think the only other thing I would just want to add is the point, coming back around to one of the points that was made, that actually this is about, how do you engage more people to engage. And I know Extinction Rebellion has held quite close to the Erica Chenoweth data point of 3.5%. If you can engage 3.5% of the population, that has, for the most part, been the number that you need in order for a government to take notice and to change. But Erica actually also came back with a new piece of research over the summer, not dispelling the 3.5% rule, but actually saying it doesn't necessarily have to be 3.5% if what you can do is engage people who, I think her languages are, it's like the elites who are in some of the pillars that are holding up the status quo. So, social and economic and political spaces. If you can engage the people in those spaces and have them defect. And I use that word actually, Ben, knowing that you have a Financial Times piece that you were highlighted in as an example of a green defector. But if you can get people that are in business to switch over and to be a part of understanding, either from inside or outside, I think, I don't know for research inside or out, but if you can get their attention, then it might mean you don't need the 3.5% of the population. You in some ways, because you have that sort of group of people that are in those established pillars, speaking out and engaging on these issues. But I also would be quick to note that I think the other side of that is it, in some ways, because you get fewer people from those places of the pillars of society engaged, it means what actually ends up happening is they open up the space to so many more people, like more than the 3.5%, because that's the influence that they're able to sort of mobilize around. So in some ways, it's less than 3.5% if you can engage these people in these positions of places like in business. And in some ways, what that does is it leads to more than 3.5%. So I'm sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but I would just sort of say I agree. It's businesses, big businesses and small businesses have different ways in which they can use their power and use their abilities. And it's worth really looking at this Erica Chenoweth stuff when it comes to the numbers and, where and how we get people. And it doesn't necessarily, by the way, it's big business that you're getting people in these established pillars. I mean, that includes small businesses, which also have huge amounts of power. But it is, again, getting them to be on side and working towards these shared goals.
Great, thank you for that. Lucy, you got in there and something that I just need to reflect on with all the different components, but it's obviously not that straightforward a question. Some great concepts in the answers. Now, we've only got 4 minutes to go, and I just wondered whether just looking at the chat, there is one of the elephant in the room questions that we've not been able to cover, but we really want to: growth. Are focused on their eternal growth, and there isn't enough resources on the planet for eternal growth, and therefore there's links back to activism that way. I don't think we can really cover that now, I'm afraid. This is a subject of a whole nother session, which we do want to put on. Just in the last couple of minutes, I wonder, I'd like to ask Craig, is there any brief question and brief answer that you would like to ask Shah or Tom from your activist point of view, as maybe the one or two things that you would urge them to do as business predominantly rather than activism predominantly individuals in their business, and likewise either Shah or Tom, back to Craig, one thing that you would like to ask from the activist world. So Craig, is there something you'd like to ask either Shah or Tom, but not both? I'm afraid we don't have time.
Yeah. So obviously Tom's already answered this. Shah, do you think in your array of businesses you can see that an activism strategy policy could be put in that allows people to take some time off, paid time off, and get support for activism?
Well, that's an easy one I can answer quite quickly. In places like the Body Shop, there are kindness days, and that is something that exists. I wouldn't be able to comment how many people use those for activism, but I that is something that it does exist within the Body Shop, and actually in the other brands as well. We have those days. In terms of where and how they are linked to activism, that's one of the things that I'm keen to explore more deeply in my role. So again, not perhaps a totally satisfying answer other than to say I see it, I feel it, and I'm exploring it.
Cool. Thank you for that. I love the kindness day for activism. That's something I definitely want to reflect on. And either Tom or Shah, you fight over it quickly. Do you have a question that you'd like to put to Craig as to what would be helpful for you for an activist to come out with to help what you're trying to do?
I have a question. Do you have any advice on how companies could find, for example, training or guidance for their employees on how to get involved safely in protests, for example?
Thank you, Craig. 20 seconds, if you can.
Yeah, I think you could reach out to any of the groups that we're familiar with now, to Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and ask someone to come in and run a training day or give a talk. And that could be on Zoom if it's more convenient for people.
Great, thank you for that. And on that very point, on the Business Declares website, you will find a link, or you can contact me, where Just Stop Oil has indeed offered to speak to any of our members and do what Craig has suggested. So thank you for reminding me of that. Right, it's 2 o'clock. In respect of your diaries, can I firstly thank our 3 fantastic panelists for your frank, open discussion and debate. Can I thank Lucy for all of your help in getting me physically able to use this app? Can I thank Sam for everything that you've been doing in the background and everything you're doing on the Walk to COP programme? And can I also thank the audience, everyone who's been on here. Sorry we didn't have time to cover all of your points, but you've been fantastic in the level of engagement and level of chat. So I think there's 49 things in the chat. So thank you very much, everyone. We'll draw it to a close, bang on 2 o'clock. Have great days, and thanks again for joining us.